Well, hello and welcome back to Books and Things. Today, another episode of What the Dickens, and today I'm going to be talking about Hard Times. Chapter 1. The One Thing Needful. Now, what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts are wanted in life, plant nothing else, and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir. When I first read Hard Times in school as a teenager, I can't remember in what order it came in my Dickens reading, but I think it was fairly late on, and I really enjoyed it. I then also got to study it quite a few times at university. I studied it in two separate modules. One was an English module in second year called Landscape and the Condition of England, where we looked at kind of social critique novels in the 19th and 20th century. And then the other module I studied it for was actually a history module. This history module was about the social history of the 19th century, and it was in fact entitled Hard Times. Now, for the seminars of this Hard Times module, our seminar group of about 8 people were given a few options as to what we wanted to do our seminars on, and I managed to persuade the tutor and our class that we really ought to do a seminar on the novel Hard Times. This was one of the options, but I feel like I was quite a little bit more enthusiastic than the rest of the class, and so I did inadvertently make 7 other people read Charles Dickens, including my boyfriend, who was then not my boyfriend. So, you know, he obviously didn't hold it against me too much, although I'm not sure he's entirely forgiven me yet. He does like Dickens, he just pretends not to. However, I have no regrets. I'm very glad that I encouraged a lot of people to read Dickens. I didn't really mean to make everyone read a novel that is not that short and not necessarily everyone's cup of tea. It just kind of happened because I really wanted to talk about Hard Times. I did the presentation for the seminar, so I did most of the talking, but yeah, I made a lot of people read Hard Times. I don't actually know how many people actually read it, apart from Nick. Nick definitely read it, but I don't know about anyone else. But anyway, Hard Times is, I think, very different to Dickens's other novels. It is possibly more philosophical and political than some of his other novels. Dickens puts across a social agenda in a lot of his books. He's putting across a point and a message and a moral in the vast majority of them, but normally I would say the plot is of more importance to the book than the message, whereas Hard Times is more of a political book, and I would say that the message often kind of overrides the plot, which is why probably it is quite low down in my favourites, even though it is one of the books from the second half of Dickens's career, which in general I like more. So Hard Times opens as you have just heard, and the speech you have just heard, all about facts, is said by Mr. Gradgrind. Now, Mr. Gradgrind resides in the fictional town of Coketown, which is basically a fictional version of Preston, and it is Dickens's only real industrial novel. It is the only novel that is set primarily in the north of England rather than in London and Kent and the surrounding areas. It follows a few different plot lines. One of the central plot lines is about Mr. Gradgrind and his children. Mr. Gradgrind is a kind of local authority. He helps in some of the running of the local mills, and he also helps in the running of the school. And Mr. Gradgrind believes that what the world needs is facts. Everyone should be brought up on facts. He despises all kind of imagination of every form. He brings up his children to know as many ologies, as Dickens refers to, as they possibly can, but to have no imagination. And very early on in the book, he catches his 2 children, Louisa and Thomas, going to a circus, and he is disgusted with them that they are possibly interested in that kind of thing. Another central character in Hard Times is someone called Mr. Bounderby. Now, Mr. Bounderby is a local mill owner, and he shares Mr. Gradgrind's love of facts. He's also not a very nice man. He has no time for emotion, and he has no time for sympathy. Another central character, and I would argue the closest Hard Times has to having a real hero, is a man called Stephen, who is a factory worker at Mr. Bounderby's factory. And Stephen is having a pretty appalling life. He was married at quite a young age to a woman who later became an alcoholic. He spends a lot of his life with her missing, and every now and then she comes back. He kind of tries to care for her as best he can, but she's often quite cruel to him, and one of the things Stephen really suffers from is that he cannot divorce her. He can't separate himself from her, which is very hard for him because Stephen and a female factory worker named Rachel have a really strong connection. They share a kind of companionship and love that has spanned a very long time, but obviously Stephen is already married to a wife who he does not love and who does not love him. What I do love about Hard Times, and what I think is really brilliant about it, is the way that it explores a lot of social and political issues at the time and a lot of cultural issues. This idea at the centre of Hard Times of facts facts versus imagination, of this kind of Victorian obsession with facts and science, to the point that it is in culture often dismissing the importance of stories and imagination. To Dickens, that is really disgusting, and he dwells quite a lot in Hard Times on this problem. The fact that by concentrating on facts and cutting out emotion out of your life, you are likely to make yourself and your family miserable. That is what is at the heart of Hard Times, and that, I feel, is really, really interesting. I also think some of the characterisation is very well done. Louisa Gradgrind, I think, is brilliant and one of Dickens's most interesting female characters. The presentation of her and her kind of inner conflicts and turmoil, the way that she's affected by the way she has been brought up, and is really, really interesting. I also think the character of Stephen is very well done. The way that Stephen's struggles in life is presented and the problems that industrialisation can bring to a lot of people are very, very interestingly examined. One of the things that is a bit trickier about Stephen is that Dickens very carefully tries to create a northern accent in a way that is quite tricky at times to read, so that sometimes Stephen is making these brilliant speeches and it is quite tricky to understand what he's saying. You have to kind of try and read it aloud. That is a bit of a problem in Hard Times, but at the same time I think the characterisation of Stephen and the relationship he has with Rachel is really tenderly and nicely done. Up until now, when I've been talking about some of Dickens's earlier works, I've been speaking about the problem I have with his presentation of women in his early fiction. I do not have that in Hard Times at all. I think his presentation of women is very interesting and the female characters are very well done. Likewise, the male characters are, and ideas of masculinity and femininity are very well explored. This idea of facts is, for Mr. Gradgrind, in part, I think, bound up with a sort of masculinity, even though he definitely doesn't want his daughter to be emotional either. I mentioned earlier that at the beginning of the book, Louisa and Thomas Gradgrind are caught going to a circus, and this circus plays quite an important part of the novel, and the circus for Dickens becomes this kind of haven of imagination and beauty and emotion and friendship. Everything that is lacking within the cold, harsh, stark, industrial world that the rest of the characters are living in, and that is a really interesting and kind of beautiful dichotomy at the heart of Hard Times. It makes for very, very interesting reading. Now, the reason I would say why Hard Times is not higher up on my list is probably because I find it more interesting than I do enjoyable and engaging, if that makes sense. I am very fond of it, but it is not as funny, it is not as delicious as some of Dickens's other novels. The characterisation is really interesting, but there is no one you can really love and adore in Hard Times, I would say, in the same way as you can in some of his other novels. I think Hard Times is a very interesting, fascinating novel. I am so glad I have studied it, both from a historical and from a literary perspective. It is such an interesting novel. The kind of philosophical and cultural ideas Dickens is exploring are really, really interesting and really well done, but the plot of Hard Times itself is not as sophisticated as a lot of Dickens's other novels. The plot is kind of there to put across his ideas rather than his ideas being carried along by the plot. Hard Times is quite a lot shorter than Dickens's many other novels, and in a way I do feel that there is a bigger novel there that Dickens didn't write. I feel like it could have been longer and more in-depth, and he could have explored these ideas a bit more complicatedly. I think that, for me, is why it's not higher up. I am very, very fond of it, and I think it's a really, truly fascinating novel. I wouldn't recommend starting with Hard Times. I mean, Nick did, and he's read another Dickens since and did enjoy it, but he enjoyed Our Mutual Friend much more than he enjoyed Hard Times, I believe. We've discussed this a bit and he agrees with me that Our Mutual Friend is better as a whole novel. Hard Times is really interesting in terms of the ideas it's putting across, but it's less good a story than a lot of Dickens's other novels. However, it is a really interesting novel. As I've been talking about it, I've kind of wished that it was higher up on the list, because even though I don't love it as much, I'm so interested in it that I feel maybe it should be higher. I don't know. It's also very interesting in that it's Dickens's only real industrial novel, and to read Hard Times alongside like Gaskell's North and South or Mary Barton is really, really interesting. I would recommend Hard Times as maybe like your third or fourth Dickens novel. It's really interesting to engage with, but I don't think it's a good place to start because the plot isn't as well developed and the characters aren't as lovable. It is a beautiful and really interesting book, and very dark at times. One of Dickens's darkest books at a lot of points, you know. It doesn't have that happy, neat, tied up, fluffy ending that a lot of his novels have, but it's a very, very interesting book and really well worth a read once you've read a few other Dickens books, because it really shows you a lot of the issues Dickens is thinking about. I mentioned in my How to Speak Victorian video about literary history the kind of prominence of social critique novels in the 19th century, and Hard Times is a really interesting one. It really shows you a lot of Dickens's thoughts about Victorian society and the problems he thought Victorian society had. But the interesting thing about Hard Times is that for Dickens, the The solution is stories. The solution is books and imagination. The solution to the industrial, scientific, fact-driven harshness of Victorian society is to dream. And that's kind of beautiful. I'm not sure if Hard Times should be so low on this list. I'm having second thoughts. The story is not as well developed as in other Dickens books, but the themes are beautiful and masterly. It is very good. I strongly recommend it after you've read a couple of other Dickens books first. As always, let me know down in the comments if you have read Hard Times and what you think of it. I'll be back tomorrow where I'll be talking about yet another Dickens book.